The cowboy never believed small decisions could change a man's entire life. He had lived alone on his dusty patch of frontier land for nearly a decade, long enough to stop expecting surprises. The days were predictable: sunrise, chores, silence, sunset. The nights were even quieter. No laughter, no voices, just the wind moving through dry grass and the creak of an old farmhouse settling into the dark. When the workload grew heavier than his agging hands could manage, he rode into town and posted a simple notice outside the general store. Farm maid needed, honest work, fair pay, no nonsense. That was it. No flowery words, no promises, certainly no thoughts of marriage. He wasn't looking for companionship, only help. Folks in town read it and chuckled. Some shook their heads. Others muttered that no decent woman would answer such an ad from a man known for keeping to himself. The cowboy didn't care. He'd learned long ago that expectations only led to disappointment. Days passed, no one came. Then late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains in gold, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of his yard. A woman, alone, still as if she'd been carved from the earth itself. She wore traditional Apache clothing, simple, worn, but carefully kept. Her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, stirred gently by the breeze. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, evidence of a long walk. She didn't call out, didn't wave, she just waited. The cowboy approached slowly, cautious but polite. "You hear about the work?" he asked. No response. At first he thought she hadn't heard him over the wind. He repeated himself, louder this time. Still nothing, but her eyes stayed fixed on his face, attentive, searching, not empty. That's when he understood. She wasn't ignoring him. She couldn't hear him. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. He had no experience with silence that wasn't his own. Communication was already scarce in his life. How would it work without words at all? He gestured toward the house, then the barn, then the fields. She nodded slowly, understanding more than he'd expected. From a small pouch, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, the very notice he'd written, now creased and smudged from travel. She pointed to it, then to herself, then placed her hand over her heart. The message was clear. She wanted the job. He hesitated, not because of who she was, but because of how little he knew. The world outside his land had been cruel, especially to people who were different. He wondered what kind of life had pushed her to walk alone toward a stranger's farm. Finally, he stepped aside and motioned her in. No handshake, no agreement spoken aloud. Just a shared understanding that, for now, this was a place to stand. As she walked past him toward the farmhouse, the cowboy felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just responsibility settling in. But deep down, something had already begun to change. The first morning began without a single spoken word between them. The cowboy woke before dawn, as he always did, expecting to move through his routine alone, but when he stepped outside, he stopped short. She was already awake. The Apache woman stood near the well, carefully drawing water with steady hands. Her movements were quiet but confident, as if she had done this work all her life. She glanced at him briefly, then offered a small nod, not shy, not bold, just respectful. He scratched his beard, unsure what to say, then remembered words wouldn't help anyway. Instead, he pointed toward the barn and mimed feeding animals. She smiled faintly and walked in that direction without hesitation. Throughout the morning, they worked side by side. He showed her tasks with gestures, how to stack hay, how to keep distance from a temperamental mule, how to lock the chicken coop. She watched closely, absorbing every detail. She didn't rush. She didn't complain. When she made mistakes, she corrected them quickly, without embarrassment. By midday, he realized something that surprised him. She worked harder than anyone he'd ever hired. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was focus. Where others talked to pass time, she observed. Where others rushed, she measured. The farm responded to her care. Animals calmed. Tools returned to their places. Even the air around the house felt different, less hollow. During lunch, he placed bread and dried meat on the table and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated, then sat across from him, folding her hands politely. When he poured water into her cup, she touched her chest again in gratitude. That small gesture lingered with him longer than he expected. Later that afternoon, trouble came in the form of a broken fence near the far field. A steer had wandered loose, stubborn and heavy. The cowboy moved to fix it alone, but before he could wave her back, she was already there, holding the post steady while he hammered it into place. The steer charged suddenly, startling him. He slipped in the dirt, but strong hands grabbed his arm and pulled him back. He looked up to see her standing firm, eyes sharp, body braced against the post. For a moment, they just stared at each other. No words, no sound. But the meaning was clear. That evening, as the sun sank low, she sat on the porch steps, watching the sky change colors. The cowboy stood nearby, unsure whether to intrude. Finally, he sat a few feet away, keeping respectful distance. He pointed to the horizon, then to her, then to the farm, trying to ask where she came from, why she was here. She thought for a moment, then she traced a line in the dirt with her finger, a long one. She placed small stones along it, then brushed some away with her hand. Loss, travel, survival. Then she pointed to the house. Here. The cowboy nodded slowly. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt shared. By the third day, the routine had settled in like it belonged there all along. The woman rose with the sun, worked until her hands were dusted with earth, and rested only when the light faded. She spoke nothing, yet the farm no longer felt quiet. It felt alive. The cowboy noticed it first in small ways. The porch was swept without him asking. His torn saddle strap had been stitched cleanly. Even the old hound, usually suspicious of strangers, followed her like a shadow. But peace on a lonely farm never stayed hidden for long. When the cowboy rode into town for supplies, she came with him, sitting straight-backed in the wagon, eyes calm but alert. The moment they arrived, conversations slowed, then stopped. People stared. Some eyes were curious, others were sharp. "She's Apache," someone muttered near the feed store. "And deaf," another added, as if that explained everything. The cowboy felt heat rise in his chest. He finished his business quickly, keeping his body between her and the worst of the stares. She noticed, of course, she always noticed. When a shopkeeper spoke too fast and too loud, she simply watched his mouth, unbothered. When a woman whispered behind her hand, she looked away without flinching. What hurt wasn't the looks. It was the fear behind them. Outside the general store, a man stepped too close, smirking. He said something the cowboy didn't catch, but the tone was enough. The cowboy moved forward, jaw tight, but before he could speak, the Apache woman lifted her hand. She shook her head. Slowly, deliberately, she signed something simple, no trouble. Then she met the man's eyes, unblinking. There was no challenge in her gaze, only dignity. The man scoffed and walked away. The cowboy exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. On the ride back, the wind pulled at her hair as she watched the land pass by. He wanted to apologize for the town, for the looks, for the things he couldn't control. Instead, he tapped his chest, then gestured toward her, then shook his head. "I won't let them hurt you." She studied his hands, then smiled, small, real, and placed her palm over his heart for just a second. The contact startled him more than any shouted insult could have. That night, a storm rolled in fast and hard. Thunder cracked the sky. Rain hammered the roof. He found her standing near the window, tense, hands clenched. Lightning flashed. She flinched. Without thinking, he moved closer, not touching, just present. He mimed calm, slow breathing. She watched him, then followed his lead. Slowly, her shoulders lowered. The storm passed, leaving silence behind. Later, she reached into a small cloth bundle she carried everywhere. From it, she took a worn piece of leather marked with symbols. She placed it between them on the table. Her past. She pointed to one symbol, fire, another, running, another empty space. Then she placed her hand flat on the table and held it there. Stillness. Home. The cowboy nodded, throat tight. He didn't know her full story yet, but he knew this much. She hadn't just come to work. She had come to begin again. The trouble didn't arrive loudly. It crept in the way dust does, quiet, patient, impossible to ignore once it's settled. It began with a broken fence rail, then a gate left open. One morning, the cowboy found his water barrel tipped over, mud soaking into the ground. No tracks, no proof, just intention. He knew where it came from. The town had decided she didn't belong. He said nothing to her at first. He fixed what was broken, worked longer hours, and kept his rifle closer than usual. But she noticed anyway. She always did. When he checked the horizon too often, when he locked the barn at night, when his jaw stayed tight even at supper. One afternoon, while he was repairing the fence, 3 riders appeared at the far edge of the land. They didn't cross onto the property. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. The cowboy stood straight, hammer hanging loose in his hand. The Apache woman came to stand beside him. She looked at the riders, then at him. Slowly, she signed a question. Danger. He hesitated, then nodded once. Her expression didn't change, but something hardened behind her eyes. She signed back, firm and clear. I will not run. That night, a note was nailed to the barn door. He found it before she did. The words were ugly, threats wrapped in excuses, warnings disguised as concern. He crushed the paper in his fist, anger burning hot and sharp. For the first time in years, he considered leaving, selling the land, taking her somewhere far from this place. But when he turned, she was there, watching him. She held out her hand. He opened his fist. She read the note slowly, carefully. When she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She folded the paper once, then again, and placed it on the table like it deserved no more space than that. Then she signed something that stopped him cold. They fear what they don't own. The next morning, the town came to him instead. 2 men arrived just after sunrise, hats low, voices polite but tight. They talked about peace, about keeping things simple, about how some arrangements caused unnecessary problems. He listened without interrupting. When they finished, he spoke calmly. She stays. They exchanged looks. She's under my roof, he continued, on my land, and anyone with an issue can bring it to me, not her. One of the men scoffed. You willing to risk everything for? The cowboy stepped forward, eyes steady. I already am. The men left without another word. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the Apache woman stood beside him on the porch. She watched the sky burn gold and red. Then she signed, slower than usual. You could lose much. He nodded. She touched her chest, then pointed to him. So could I. They stood there as the light faded, 2 people from different worlds, choosing the same ground. The land was quiet, but it felt stronger. And for the first time since she arrived, the cowboy understood something clearly. This wasn't charity. This was loyalty. And he would defend it, no matter the cost. The trouble finally stepped into the light on market day. The cowboy hadn't planned to bring her into town again so soon, but supplies were low, and avoiding the world forever wasn't living, it was hiding. She climbed onto the wagon without hesitation, her posture calm, eyes steady. Whatever waited beyond the road, she would face it standing. The town square was crowded when they arrived. Horses tied to posts, vendors calling out prices, the usual noise of trade and gossip. The moment people noticed her, the noise shifted, not louder, sharper. Whispers followed them like dust. She's the deaf one. Apache. Living on his land. The cowboy kept his hand near her, not gripping, just present. She caught his glance and gave a small nod. I'm all right. At the dry goods store, a clerk refused to look at her. He spoke only to the cowboy, slow and loud, as if volume could replace respect. The cowboy felt his temper rise, but before he could answer, she stepped forward. She placed her hand on the counter. The room quieted. With deliberate movements, she signed, clear, practiced, unafraid. Then she pointed to her ears, shook her head, and placed her hand over her heart. Finally, she pointed to the list of supplies. The meaning was unmistakable. I understand, I work, I belong. Someone laughed nervously, another looked away. The clerk swallowed and rang up the order without another word. Outside, a man blocked their path. You bringing trouble to this town, he said, eyes cold. She don't fit. The cowboy stepped forward, but she touched his arm. She moved around him and faced the man directly. She pointed to the ground, then to the sky, then to herself. Her hands moved faster now, stronger. She traced a scar on her arm, then crossed her wrists as if bound, then opened her hands wide. Freedom! Her eyes never left his. The man shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not silent, undeniable strength. She's deaf, someone muttered, not dumb. The words spread like a ripple. The man stepped back, not defeated, but exposed. On the ride home, the cowboy said nothing for a long while. Finally, he tapped his chest and signed awkwardly, copying her movements from memory. Proud. She smiled, wider than he'd ever seen. That evening, she showed him more of her past, signs for places she'd been turned away from, hands that had pushed her aside, doors closed without explanation. Then she signed something new. Here I stand. He nodded, you do. Later, as the fire crackled low, he realized the truth he'd been circling for days. She wasn't fragile. She had been forced to be strong in a world that refused to listen. And now, standing beside her, he wasn't protecting something weak. He was standing with someone unbreakable. The town had drawn a line, but she had crossed it with her head held high. And the cowboy knew the final choice, the one neither of them had spoken yet, was no longer far away. The farm felt different after that day in town. Not quieter, steadier. The threats stopped. The riders no longer appeared at the edge of the land. Word had spread, not through shouting, but through something stronger, resolve. People understood now that she was not passing through, and the cowboy was not backing down. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, the cowboy sat on the porch steps, rubbing tired hands together. She joined him, handing over a cup of warm water, watching his face instead of the sky. He took a slow breath. For days, something had pressed against his chest, words he didn't know how to say, promises he didn't want to rush. He had never been good with speeches, never believed in grand declarations. So he did what felt honest. He stood, walked into the house, and returned with a small wooden box. Inside was a simple ring, no engraving, no shine meant to impress. Just solid metal, worn smooth by time, like the life he understood. He knelt in front of her. No words. He placed the ring gently in her open palm and then rested his hand over hers. He looked up, searching her eyes, not for permission, but understanding. She froze for a heartbeat. Then her breath caught. Tears welled, spilling freely down her cheeks as she nodded again and again. She slid the ring onto her finger herself, pressing her forehead against his. In that moment, no sound was needed. The seasons turned. They worked the land together, planting, harvesting, repairing. He learned her signs better. She learned his habits, his silences, his stubborn kindness. Neighbors came to accept what they could not change. Some even came to respect it. Children passing, the farm waved. Travelers stopped for water and left with stories of a place where a deaf Apache woman ran a farm with quiet authority and a cowboy who listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, she stood at the fence, watching the wind move through the grass. He joined her, resting his arm beside hers. She signed slowly. I was never broken. He nodded, I know. She smiled. Later that night, under a sky crowded with stars, they sat side by side. The world felt wide, but no longer lonely. The cowboy had posted an ad for a farm maid. What he found was a partner, a teacher, a home. And the Apache woman, once ignored, once cast aside, had found a place where her silence was not a barrier, but a language of trust. Their story was never loud, but it was lasting. And in the quiet rhythm of shared days, they proved something the world often forgets. Love doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrives with understanding and stays forever.